August 17, 1943, east of Kharkov, Ukrainian SSR. The convoy was already 2 hours late when the first sound came. Not the distant thrum of engines, not the rattle of track links or the cough of soot-clogged carburetors, but silence. A sudden, creeping hush that spread across the wheat fields and pine groves like a breath being held. Then the howl. Here it fell from above in a staggered wave. The Doppler scream of sirens fixed to diving bombers, the infamous Jericho trumpets of the Junkers U-87 Stuka. Lieutenant Semyon Pavlovich Vasin, seated behind the wheel of the lead Studebaker transport, didn't flinch. His knuckles turned white on the wheel. The vehicle was loaded with fuel barrels, enough to turn the whole truck into a fireball if a single shell found its mark. Behind him, over 200 vehicles stretched down the road. Tanks, trucks, ambulances, mobile kitchens, repair wagons, all crawling through the scorched wreckage east of Kharkov. It was the 9th Guards Mechanized Corps, rearmed and refitted after weeks of retreat. Their objective was to push south into the rear of the German 4th Panzer Army and support the liberation of Poltava. But they couldn't get there if they were dead before lunch. The Stukas came in low, as they always did. Black crosses flashing against the sun. Each bomb they dropped weighed 250 kilograms. Each one could tear open a tank like a toy and flip a lorry end over end with sheer blast pressure. And they knew the roads. The Luftwaffe had spent months mapping every arterial supply route, every junction, every possible bottleneck. This one was called Route 19B, a stretch of half-paved highway that ran in a shallow arc between two ridgelines. It was perfect for a convoy and suicidal under air attack. The Germans had bombed it 4 times in 3 weeks, but it was the only route on the maps. The first bomb hit 2 trucks back, ammunition transport. The explosion tore both vehicles in half. Flames curled up into the wheat like fingers. The shockwave knocked out windows in the following 10 vehicles. Men scattered, someone screamed, another shouted for a medic already dead. Vasin ground his teeth, pulled the truck to a halt, and yanked open the door. A spray of dirt showered him from a near miss. He didn't duck. His eyes scanned the sky, then the hills. And then he saw it. A groove, half hidden in the landscape. A dark scar running along the edge of a ravine, like a line scratched by some ancient claw. It was not on any map, not mentioned in the motor route orders, not charted on the regimental movement charts. But it was there. It ran south, parallel to Route 19B, but sunken, narrow, flanked by tall grass and ruined fence posts. Perhaps an old farm track, perhaps older still. Vasin had no orders to divert, but he'd seen enough of these bombings to know one truth. The Luftwaffe didn't just bomb convoys, they bombed patterns. He sprinted to the next vehicle, a 37mm anti-aircraft gun on a wheeled mount. "Sergeant," he barked, "get that thing into the ditch and point west. Orders are to stay on the—" "They're bombing the road, not us." The sergeant hesitated. 10 seconds, Vasin said, "or we all burn." The gun was turned. Another truck followed, then 2 more. Within 5 minutes, a third of the column had peeled off into the hidden path, slipping below the horizon line, vanishing like ghosts into the terrain. The Stukas looped again, aiming for where the trucks had been. They dropped 4 more bombs. Only one hit anything. Vasin watched from the grass line as the road erupted behind him. A fuel truck went up like a signal flare to hell, but the rest of the convoy, his part, kept moving. Slowly, obscurely, but moving. By dusk, 78 vehicles had followed the unknown route. It curved, narrowed, then rejoined the main path 6 kilometers south, outside the pre-calculated kill zone used by German spotters. The next morning, only Vasin's section arrived intact at the rally point outside Poltava. 3 days later, in the operations tent of the 3rd Ukrainian Front, the matter was raised. Vasin stood before a folding table covered in maps, his boots still caked in the earth of that hidden track. Colonel Vereshchagin, eyes red from lack of sleep, leaned over the table. "Where did you find that route, Lieutenant?" Vasin pointed at the open map. "Here," he said, then tapped 3 centimeters off the printed road. "But it's not printed." "Explain." Vasin hesitated, then reached into his satchel and pulled out a notebook, half burned, edges curled with soot. Inside, pages of scrawled notes, measurements, scribbles, even hand-drawn topographic sketches. "I used to work as a postal inspector before the war," he said. "Kursk, Kharkov, all the way down to Dnipropetrovsk. I used to travel these roads. Not the official ones, the postal routes. Old estate trails, wagon lines, tracks that don't show up on army maps because they were last used in 1905. Vereshchagin blinked. "You memorized them?" "Drew them. Every time I saw one. Sometimes they changed with the seasons, but the bones were always there. You're telling me you navigated 78 vehicles through a pre-industrial ox path during an active bombing raid?" "I didn't navigate them. I hid them. The Germans were bombing a line. I moved in a shadow next to it." No one spoke for a long time. Then Vereshchagin motioned for a staff officer. "Get me General Malinovsky." Over the next 2 weeks, Vasin was transferred from line duty to a new improvised unit within the 3rd Ukrainian Front, Section 221R, later officially designated as the Topographical Evasion Group, TEG. Its mission was to identify non-standard routes for troop and vehicle movements across contested sectors, specifically ones that diverged from German aerial reconnaissance data. At first it was just Vasin, then a team of 2, then 4. By mid-September, they had mapped 11 previously unlisted routes across the Kharkov-Poltava corridor. Some were old smuggler trails, others were disused railbeds, partially dismantled during the revolution. Still others were footpaths widened just enough to take a truck if the driver was brave, and stupid enough. They called them ghost roads. Each one was charted by hand, tested under night marches, then assigned coded names for unit dispatch. Every successful movement increased trust in the system, and the Luftwaffe. They kept bombing the roads, but the convoys were no longer on them. October 3, 1943, south of Dniprodzerzhinsk. A major push was underway to secure the western bank of the Dnipro River. German forces had destroyed bridges and mined crossing points. Soviet logistics was strained to the breaking point. Fuel shortages, delays, night raids, whole tank units stuck waiting for petrol that never arrived. Section 221R proposed an unthinkable solution. Run a supply column over the riverbed itself. Not a ford, not a bridge, a riverbed. Drought had pulled the Dnipro to historic lows. Vasin had remembered stories of ox drivers crossing in dry years, guiding carts along sandbars just inches above the waterline. He scouted the area personally, on foot, alone, with a walking stick and a yard of measuring rope. He found it. 3 hours later, against direct orders from the Regional Transport Command, he led a 26-vehicle fuel column across the bottom of the Dnipro. Not one vehicle was lost. Luftwaffe spotters had no idea where they'd gone. One pilot later reported, "Convoy vanished from visual between grid sectors." He was reprimanded for poor discipline. He wasn't lying. By November, the reputation of Section 221R was spreading. Entire divisions began requesting alternate route packets. Staff officers, previously wedded to grid lines and military topography, now sought out a man who drew maps by memory and instinct. But Vasin wasn't interested in accolades. He was interested in movement. His logic was brutal. If you move where they expect, you die. If you move where they don't expect, but you still arrive, you win. That winter, his group helped relocate a field hospital across 80 kilometers of swamp using a series of raised peat trails abandoned since the Tsarist era. No aircraft saw them. No artillery reached them. Every patient survived the transfer. By war's end, Section 221R had identified 37 usable ghost routes in Ukraine alone, including 10 that passed within German forward operating zones undetected. Their maps would be copied by partisans, smuggled to other fronts, and sometimes used long after the war to rebuild post-war infrastructure. The German army never understood what had changed. Their intelligence reports spoke of unexpected deviations, of non-linear Soviet movement patterns, and of breakdowns in anticipated logistics targeting. They never grasped the truth, that a man who once sorted mail and memorized horse paths had redrawn the flow of war. January 1944, along the frozen ridges of central Ukraine, near Kirovohrad. The snow came sideways that month, thick sheets of ice-choked wind blowing off the steppe like nature was trying to erase the front itself. Whiteout conditions turned soldiers into silhouettes and roads into riddles. For most units, movement ground to a halt. Convoys became graveyards. Even where the Luftwaffe couldn't fly, frostbite could still kill. But Section 221R kept moving. Semyon Vasin no longer rode in the lead truck. He had a horse now, an emaciated grey gelding named Mok, whose hooves knew mud like Vasin knew maps. He preferred to scout alone when possible, riding ahead of convoys with nothing but a field compass, a trenching spade, and a lantern with the glass blackened on one side. He had become more than a lieutenant. By then, his name circulated like a legend in the motor pool camps. "You're taking the 18th Logistics? Better hope Vasin laid a line." "Command wants us in Novoarkhangelsk by Tuesday, only if the postman's riding again." They meant it literally. Vasin's routes now had formal designations in operations planning, but to the soldiers, they were just postman's paths. Narrow, winding, often suicidal, but quiet, obscure, survivable. The Germans couldn't hit what they didn't expect, and they never expected Vasin's madness. That winter, in a bombed-out church in Dolinska repurposed as a transport HQ, Vasin submitted a handwritten proposal to the Divisional Chief of Staff, Major Grigory Lisov. It was 6 pages long, stained with mud, filled with diagrams of valleys and ridges, dotted lines tracing arcs around mined roads and known air surveillance paths. The final line simply read, "If we move 32 kilometers east and 11 kilometers south, we can bypass both air interdiction zones and re-enter at Mykolaiivka, using old farm roads from pre-revolutionary land grant estates. I've confirmed them by boot." Lisov stared at the map. "No one has moved through those sectors in years," he said. "No one was trying to win a war through a hay trail," Vasin replied. Lisov approved it. 3 days later, 42 trucks, 7 mobile kitchens, and 6 towed artillery pieces crossed 50 kilometers of unpatrolled countryside, using nothing more than Vasin's hand-sketched topography and his own foot-worn markers. When they arrived ahead of schedule without casualties, the divisional quartermaster reportedly wept. That night, Vasin didn't celebrate. He was already preparing the next route, an even more dangerous one, through the Black Forest of Inhulka. The Black Forest wasn't on any map, not under that name. It was a jagged patch of old-growth pine and dense underbrush northeast of Kryvyi Rih, once part of a noble hunting estate, now overgrown, mined in some sections and abandoned in others. Locals whispered of German patrols who entered and never returned. Vasin saw something different. The canopy was too thick for Luftwaffe spotters, the ravines too narrow for armored pursuit, and the snow, though deep, was insulated from the wind. He spent 2 days inside it, alone, leaving small marker stones every kilometer. When he emerged, covered in frost and coughing from smoke inhalation after burning ticks off his coat, he reported simply, "Viable, marked, recommend test movement." His commanders thought him insane. But by that time, his record made disbelief a luxury. 2 days later, the 41st Tank Regiment moved through the forest in single file, each tank guided by Vasin's markers and one designated forward observer. It took 19 hours. Not a single aircraft spotted them. They emerged behind the German lines near Znamyanka. That was the first time the Red Army captured a village from the rear with tanks that no one knew were coming. The effect on German morale was immediate. Captured Wehrmacht radio intercepts from that night include one frantic message: "Panzerstellung breached from west. No prior sighting. No tire tracks. Cannot explain vector. Are the Soviets tunneling?" By March 1944, Section 221R was no longer considered experimental. It was now attached to the 1st Guards Tank Army as an embedded reconnaissance and mobility doctrine team. Its ranks had grown to include former railroad workers, forestry officials, partisans, and even a circus performer who once walked tightropes across the Dniester. Vasin used him to help judge structural integrity on old rope bridges. They operated like shadows, quiet, methodical, strange. At least one general referred to them as the caravan of ghosts. But their success was measurable. Between August 1943 and April 1944, they had rerouted over 2,000 vehicles off targeted roads, reduced average loss rates from 38% to under 12% on redirected convoys, enabled 4 separate tactical surprises by moving support units through unguarded terrain, and established a new mobility doctrine now studied in rear echelon transport command schools. None of this would have happened without Vassin's maps, and yet those maps were never printed. Each one was hand-drawn, layered, alive. One page might show a forest path, the next, how it changed when it rained. Another marked potential shelter spots, another escape routes in case of shelling. He drew them not with an engineer's precision, but with a hunter's intuition. He knew where a wheel would stick, where a riverbed would rise, where a plane would see, and where it wouldn't. On April 8, 1944, a final test came. German forces had just withdrawn from Mykolaiv, and Soviet armored divisions needed to close the gap before they could regroup around Voznesensk. Speed was critical. But the main roads were all cratered. Rail lines were demolished. Vassin suggested a 45-kilometer curve maneuver using old irrigation lines and trench works from the Tsarist Russo-Turkish campaigns. Narrow enough for motorcycles, just wide enough for jeeps and towed artillery. High Command balked. They needed to move tanks. Vassin nodded, then proposed something unthinkable. Build the road as they went. He called it rolling mobility. An idea that the route didn't have to exist before movement. It just had to exist far enough ahead to stay ahead of the column. Each forward team laid fascines, gravel, and planks, moving in tandem with the lead vehicles. It was absurd, exhausting, primitive, but it worked. The 47th Mechanized Battalion arrived on the outskirts of Voznesensk 18 hours ahead of projection, and when the Luftwaffe arrived, they bombed empty roads. May 1944, Soviet Second Ukrainian Front, near Iași, Romania. The hills south of the Prut River were green now, alive with spring after a winter soaked in artillery and retreat. The mud had dried into cracked ribbons, and the grass swayed in bright, indifferent winds. But above that serenity came the same old shriek of aircraft engines, the vulture song of German dive bombers looking for prey. Columns of Red Army vehicles, so many, so slow, snaked their way toward Romania's border towns. The offensive to crush Axis forces in the Balkans had begun. Fuel was short. Time was shorter. The Luftwaffe's surviving bomber squadrons had retreated to Romania, and despite losses, they retained air superiority in broad daylight. And yet, as wave after wave of bombers pounded every main road east of the Prut, something strange happened. They missed. Convoys were no longer where maps said they'd be. 2 truck formations bypassed road junctions by rolling through flooded vineyards. A mobile anti-aircraft battery was spotted west of the river, 3 days ahead of schedule, without crossing any major road. German spotter reports grew frantic. Soviet traffic untraceable, convoy sightings inconsistent, suspect decoy operations or falsified positions. They were wrong. There were no decoys. There was only Semyon Vassin. By this stage of the war, Vassin's methods had matured from improvised route hunting to a philosophy of movement. His notebooks, now filling 3 crates, had evolved into a kind of living code. Each new path informed by observations, not just geography, but psychology. He understood how the Luftwaffe thought. They preferred symmetry, patterns, repetition, bombing lanes, predictable intersections. Everything about the Soviet logistics system had, for years, fed into that preference, until Vassin. He taught his unit that to break the kill chain, they had to break the rhythm. Convoys were split into irregular clusters. Vehicles paused at unnatural intervals. Drivers were trained to veer and correct at specific intervals, so any spotter trying to triangulate speed and direction would miscalculate. When confronted about it by a skeptical logistics officer, Vassin replied, "If you fly at 300 km/h, you don't bomb what you see, you bomb what you think you see." He exploited that gap. His field manuals, never formally published, were passed from battalion to battalion under the name Vassin's Compass. They included absurd instructions: pause under tree canopy for exactly 22 minutes, then proceed at half speed in zigzag. If plane sighted, break line into star pattern, hold until shadow passes. Avoid converging roads at dawn. It's when the enemy recalibrates. To outsiders it sounded superstitious, but to the men whose lives depended on arriving alive, It was scripture. June 1944. The Iași offensive begins. Vasin is ordered to map a route into the Bahlui River Valley for an armored corps under General Ribalco. The mission? Bypass German fortifications outside Târgu Frumos and strike the rear before a counterattack can be organized. The maps are useless. Bridges are gone. The roads have been mined, some layered with explosives and debris deep enough to fool even the most cautious sappers. Vasin looks for something else. Old peasant trails. Abandoned water management paths. Collapsed irrigation lines. He finds one. A disused canal bed carved into the earth a century ago, never paved, filled with reeds and stagnant water. He proposes the insane again. Drive the tanks through the canal. It's narrow, slippery, barely wider than a turret ring. But the reeds hide them from aerial spotters. The embankments break up their silhouettes, and the route leads straight into the flank of the German defense. Over 3 nights, 74 tanks move through the Vasin cut. Not one is spotted. They emerge like ghosts from the east and tear through the stunned rear guard. Târgu Frumos falls in days. A German POW reportedly asked his interrogator, "Where did the tanks come from? There was no road." Back at HQ, Vasin is offered a commendation. He refuses it. Instead, he asks for something else: canvas, ink, and time. He spends 2 weeks drawing a new series of maps, not for the front, but for the planners behind it. His goal is simple: institutionalize chaos, teach movement officers to think like him, to find the blind spots in enemy doctrine and hide entire divisions inside them. His final report to the First Ukrainian Front includes the following line: "The battlefield is not just terrain, it is expectation. Break that, and you break the enemy's aim before they ever fire." By July, Vasin's techniques are formally adopted into new rear echelon mobility guidelines. They are anonymized, of course, filtered through bureaucracy. But on the bottom margin of the original draft, scrawled in grease pencil in Vasin's own hand, there's a single phrase: "To move unseen is to command without rank." August 1944. Bulgaria-Romania border, night crossing near the Danube. By now, the war was folding. German lines in the Balkans were buckling, their once-feared mechanized regiments now trapped between overstretched supply lines and Soviet salients that appeared from nowhere. But to those inside the Soviet command tents, that nowhere had a name. It was Vasin's shadow. That summer, the Danube was in flood, swollen by alpine runoff and heavy rains across Hungary. The Red Army needed to move 3 corps across within 4 days, an impossibility by bridge, by pontoon, or by any method known to the Central Transport Commission. But Vasin had a theory. He and his team scouted upstream in silence. On the 4th day, he returned with dirt under his fingernails, bruises on his legs, and a plan. "Fisherman's Crossing," he said. "There's a rise, mid-river. It's real. I walked it." The idea was ludicrous. Send trucks, men, and horses across the Danube on a seasonal sandbar, exposed at low tide during only a single hour of pre-dawn moonlight. Can't map it, can't mark it, but it's there. And they did it. Vasin stood in waist-high water for 2 hours with a lantern and a red kerchief, guiding each vehicle wheel by wheel across the current. Over 600 men and 140 vehicles crossed on foot and tire. Not a single Luftwaffe sortie noticed. No one could believe it. To the Germans, the crossing seemed like a phantom movement. They reported being attacked by Soviet artillery positioned in territory not yet crossed. One field marshal blamed it on Romanian betrayal. It wasn't betrayal. It was a postman's sense of the land. October 1944, Budapest offensive preparation. By now, the idea of Vasin routes had entered official staff jargon, especially among field commanders who relied on Section 221R for impossible moves. One staff note from the 46th Army included the phrase, "Request Vasin route variant for southern approach. Main roads mined and shelled." His maps were no longer just tools. They were part of operational planning. And still, Vasin refused promotion. "I'm not command. I'm the shadow that helps command get there." He remained a lieutenant. But by this point, his command included 19 route scouts, 4 draft cartographers, 2 linguists, and a former village midwife whose sense of weather was more accurate than meteorological charts. They mapped orchard paths, dry creek beds, old war trenches from the Great War, and even rail embankments pulled up for wood salvage, now turned into tire-width convoys that moved battalions at night in complete silence. They crossed entire valleys without headlights, crossed gorges on rope-tensioned bridges, scavenged from downed transmission lines. When German planes circled overhead, they stopped under linen stretched between tree lines to break their silhouettes. It was not military science, it was human engineering against machine logic. December 1944, the last Stuka trap. Though the Luftwaffe was in decline, remnants of its ground attack wings still operated over Slovakia, especially in snow cover when Soviet formations had fewer places to hide. One such wing, Grupa 2, STG-77, still operated from makeshift runways outside Bratislava, terrorizing convoys on the approach to Hungary. They had adapted. Their bombers flew lower, their timing more erratic, and one of their favorite targets was the Kremnica-Zvolen junction, where 4 key supply roads converged in a tight mountain pass. Soviet command was ready to write off the junction. Losses were too high. Vasin said no. He proposed a bypass, not around the roads, but through them. He and 3 scouts took 72 hours to chart a zigzag path through abandoned coal tunnels in the low Tatras, partially collapsed, some flooded, none marked. They verified every beam, reinforced where needed, and vented the tunnels with improvised chimneys made from smashed stovepipes. On Christmas Eve, under blackout orders, 12 supply trucks and 3 command vehicles moved through the earth itself. The next day, German bombers attacked the junction, and again, there was nothing there. February 1945, final approach to Vienna. Section 221R received its final task: support the Third Ukrainian Front's push through Hungary into Austria. Roads were packed, rail lines stretched, movement stalled. Vasin requested no trucks, no staff. He took a sled. He crossed 40 kilometers of hill country alone, using old military boundary lines from 1912. By the time he returned, he had drawn a 63-kilometer arc route that bypassed all Luftwaffe flight corridors and rail strikes. In its final report, submitted days before the fall of Vienna, Vasin wrote, "The fastest way to win is not through strength, but through the empty space beside it." He never filed another report. May 9, 1945, Victory Day. Vasin stood in a field hospital on the outskirts of Vienna, tending to a wounded horse, Mock, still alive. The war was over. He'd led hundreds of vehicles, thousands of men, and untold amounts of materiel through routes that never existed on paper. His contributions had saved lives, shaped battles, and rewritten movement doctrine. He did not attend the Moscow victory parades. He was never decorated beyond a single order of the Red Star. His maps were filed in crates, then archived under low priority. But every soldier who survived an ambush that never came, every convoy that arrived where no convoy could go, remembered the name, or at least the idea: the postman's ghost.